Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished leaders and friends, it is an honor and a privilege to return to Kyiv, my third visit to your beautiful country, and a privilege to be asked to speak to you today. Each time I return, I feel something that is difficult to describe, but it is impossible to ignore. It is a sense of clarity. Clarity about what matters, clarity about what is at stake, and clarity about who is carrying that burden. So let me begin differently today. Not by speaking about Ukraine, but by speaking to you. To those defending this country, to those holding families, communities, and institutions together under extraordinary strain. The world sees you, and the world respects you. I am not here as a politician. I am here as a soldier who understands service, as a humanitarian who has seen the human cost of conflict, and as a friend of Ukraine who believes the world must not grow used to this war or numb to its consequences. Because what is happening here is not simply a war about territory. It is a war about values, about sovereignty, about whether the principles that underpin our shared democracy shall hold meaning. The theme of this forum, as we've heard, asks darkness or dawn? Is light ahead?
Prince Harry walked into Kyiv. Not a simulation, not a carefully curated royal engagement with perfect lighting and polite applause. A real place. A place that has felt the weight of war. A place where uncertainty isn't theoretical, it's daily life. And when he stood up to speak at the Kyiv Security Forum, the response wasn't stiff. It wasn't forced. It was loud. Cheers, applause, energy. And that alone should tell you everything. Because people who are living through something real don't waste energy applauding empty gestures. They don't clap just because someone has a title. They respond when they recognize something genuine. And that's where the difference begins. Because what you just heard in that clip, that wasn't a performance. That was clarity. And let's talk about that word for a second, because he repeats it for a reason. Clarity about what matters. Clarity about what's at stake. Clarity about who is carrying the burden. You don't get that kind of clarity from comfort. You don't get it from palace walls or press briefings or carefully rehearsed talking points. You get it from proximity to reality. And that's exactly what makes this moment so powerful. Because instead of making it about himself, instead of opening with some grand speech about geopolitics or positioning himself as some kind of authority figure, he flips it immediately. He says, "I'm not here to talk about Ukraine. I'm here to talk to you." That shift, that's respect. That's recognizing that the people in that room, the people in that country, are not props in someone else's narrative. They are the story. And you can feel it in the way he speaks. To those defending this country, to those holding families, communities, and institutions together. That's not abstract language. That's direct. That's human. And then comes the line that hits like a quiet hammer. The world sees you, and the world respects you. Simple. No fluff, no exaggeration. But in a place where people are constantly carrying the weight of survival, of responsibility, of uncertainty, being seen matters. And here's where things get uncomfortable for certain critics. Because he doesn't show up as a politician. He doesn't pretend to be one. He hides behind diplomatic language designed to offend no one and mean nothing. He says exactly what he is. A soldier, a humanitarian, a friend. And whether people like it or not, those aren't empty labels. They come with experience, with history, with credibility that can't be manufactured overnight. Because here's the truth that doesn't get said enough. You can rehearse empathy. You can script compassion. You can stage concern. But you cannot fake understanding when you're standing in a place that has lived through conflict. People know. They always know. And the reaction in that room, that applause, that energy, that was recognition. Recognition of someone who isn't just passing through for a headline, but someone who understands, at least in part, the weight of service and sacrifice. And then he goes deeper. He reframes the war, not as a distant conflict, not as a geopolitical chess match, but as something much bigger. A war about values, a war about sovereignty, a war about whether the principles people talk about actually mean anything when they're tested. And this is where the speech quietly shifts from acknowledgement to challenge. Because it's one thing to say you believe in democracy, in freedom, in sovereignty. It's another entirely to stand by those beliefs when they cost something, when they require action, when they demand consistency. And that's the uncomfortable question sitting underneath his words. Do these values still matter? Or are they just convenient talking points? Now, let's pause for a second and look at the bigger picture, because this is where things start to get interesting. While he's standing there in Kyiv talking about clarity, about values, about not becoming numb to the reality of war, what's happening elsewhere? Endless cycles of distraction. Stories that go nowhere, outrage manufactured over things that don't actually matter in the grand scheme of anything. And yet here's someone choosing to step into a space where the stakes are real, where the consequences are visible, where the conversations actually mean something. It's a different level of engagement, and that difference is hard to ignore because it exposes something. It exposes the gap between performance and purpose, between showing up and actually standing for something. And you don't have to like him to see that. You just have to be honest. Now, let's talk about that final part of the clip. Darkness or dawn? Is light ahead? That question isn't just rhetorical, it's heavy. Because in a place that has endured so much, it would be easy, almost natural, to focus entirely on the darkness, to let it define everything. But instead of offering empty optimism, instead of pretending everything is fine or that things will magically get better, he acknowledges that weight. He doesn't dismiss it. He doesn't minimize it. He recognizes it. And that's what gives any hope he talks about later real substance. Because hope without acknowledgement is just noise. But hope that comes after recognizing reality, that means something. And this is where the speech quietly does something powerful. It balances truth and belief. Truth about the hardship, belief in what's still possible. And that balance is rare. Because most people lean too far in one direction. Either everything is doom and gloom, or everything is painted in unrealistic positivity. But here, there's a middle ground. And that's where the message lives. Now, let's zoom out even further, because this isn't just about one speech. This isn't just about one moment in Kyiv. This is about a pattern of showing up in spaces that aren't easy, a pattern of engaging with issues that don't come with guaranteed applause or safe headlines, a pattern of choosing substance over spectacle. And that pattern matters. Because consistency builds credibility, not titles, not narratives, not opinions shouted into the void. Consistency. And here's the part that really makes certain corners of the media uncomfortable. It's hard to dismiss someone when they keep doing the work. It's hard to reduce everything to a headline when the actions don't match the narrative being pushed. It's hard to maintain a certain image when reality keeps contradicting it. And that's what we're seeing here, a collision between narrative and reality. And reality is winning. Now, does that mean this changes everything overnight? Of course not. The world doesn't work like that. There will still be criticism, there will still be spin, there will still be people determined to interpret everything through their own lens, no matter what. But moments like this, they stick, they linger, they create contrast. And once people see that contrast, it's hard to unsee it, because suddenly the difference becomes obvious between words and actions, between presence and performance, between noise and meaning. And that's why this matters. Not because it's perfect, not because it's beyond criticism, but because it's real. And in a world that often feels saturated with artificial everything, real stands out. So when you hear that applause, when you see that reaction, when you listen to those words, understand what you're actually witnessing. It's not just a speech. It's a moment where connection happened, where recognition happened, where someone stood in a place that demands honesty and spoke in a way that reflected it. And whether people like it or not, that kind of moment carries weight.
And here's the part that really deserves attention. The part that doesn't get clipped into short headlines or reduced into neat little sound bites. Presence. Because showing up matters. And not the kind of showing up where everything is choreographed down to the second, where every handshake is rehearsed, where every smile is measured for maximum optics. Not that kind. This is different. This is showing up in a place where unpredictability is part of the environment, where things are not polished, where the atmosphere carries weight, history, tension. And when someone chooses to step into that kind of space, it changes the entire tone of the conversation. Because suddenly, this isn't theoretical anymore. This isn't distant. This is real. And you can feel that reality in the way he speaks. There's no attempt to overcomplicate things, no need to hide behind complicated language or political phrasing that sounds impressive but says absolutely nothing. Instead, it's direct, grounded, focused. And that's what makes it land. Now, let's talk about something people don't like to admit. Courage looks different depending on the context. For some, courage is standing behind a podium in a safe environment, delivering lines that have been approved, polished, and repeated 100 times. For others, courage is stepping into uncertainty, into discomfort, into spaces where things are not guaranteed to go smoothly. And whether people like it or not, there's a very clear difference, because one is controlled, the other isn't. And in Kyiv, there is no illusion of control. There is only reality. And that reality demands something different from anyone who enters it. It demands sincerity. It demands awareness. It demands respect. And that's exactly what you're seeing here. Now, let's address the obvious contrast that nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone is thinking. While this is happening, while there's a speech grounded in reality, in lived experience, in actual global significance, there are still entire sections of media dedicated to dissecting things that, in comparison, feel almost trivial. Outfits, body language, imaginary tensions, endless speculation cycles that generate heat, but no light. And it would be funny if it wasn't so revealing, because it shows where attention is being directed, and more importantly, where it's not. Meanwhile, in a completely different lane, you have someone standing in a war-affected country saying, "Do not look away. Do not become numb. Do not let this become background noise." That's not entertainment. That's not distraction. That's a call to awareness. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Awareness requires effort. It requires people to engage with things that are not easy, not convenient, not neatly packaged. And in a world that often prefers quick, digestible content over deeper understanding, that kind of message doesn't always get the spotlight it deserves. But moments like this force it into view anyway.
because they carry weight. And weight is hard to ignore. Now, let's dig a little deeper into that idea of not becoming numb, because that line is doing more work than people realize. Numbness is dangerous. Not dramatic, explosive danger, quiet danger. The kind that creeps in slowly, the kind that turns ongoing crises into background noise, the kind that makes people scroll past headlines without really absorbing what they mean. And over time, that numbness creates distance.
Distance from empathy, distance from urgency, distance from responsibility. And that's exactly what he's pushing against. He's saying, don't let this become normal. Don't let something this serious fade into the background of your attention. Because once that happens, the consequences don't just disappear. They continue. They just happen out of sight. And that's a message that extends far beyond Ukraine. It's about how people engage with the world in general, what they choose to pay attention to, what they choose to ignore, and why. Now, let's bring it back to the reaction in that room, because that matters more than any headline. Applause in that context isn't casual, it's not polite, it's not automatic, it's earned. And it tells you something very simple. The message connected, not because it was perfect, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt real. And real resonates, especially in environments where authenticity isn't optional, it's required. And that's why this moment stands out, because it cuts through layers of noise, layers of narrative, layers of distraction, and lands somewhere solid. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Because moments like this don't just exist in isolation. They create ripple effects. They shift perception, even if only slightly. They introduce contrast, even if some people try to ignore it. And over time, those small shifts start to add up. Because once people start noticing the difference between substance and performance, they can't unsee it. And that changes how everything else is received. Suddenly, empty gestures feel emptier. Suddenly, rehearsed lines feel more obvious. Suddenly, the gap between what is said and what is done becomes harder to ignore. And that's where the real impact begins. Not in one speech, not in one moment, but in the accumulation of moments that challenge perception. Now, let's talk about legacy for a second. Not the kind of legacy that's built on titles or tradition or expectation, the kind that's built on choices, on actions, on where someone decides to stand and what they decide to stand for. Because at the end of the day, that's what defines it. Not what people say, not what headlines claim, but what actually happens. And in this case, the choice was clear: to show up, to speak, to acknowledge, to stand in a place that demands more than surface-level engagement. And that choice carries weight, whether people want to admit it or not. Now, does that mean everyone will suddenly agree? Of course not. Agreement was never the goal. Understanding is, recognition is, and those things don't require unanimous approval. They just require people to see what's in front of them. And what's in front of them here is a moment that feels grounded, intentional, real. And in a world that often feels saturated with the opposite, that's significant. So when people look back at this, when they revisit this moment, when they hear that applause and those words, they're not just going to remember the speech, they're going to remember the context, the environment, the contrast, and the clarity. Because that's what makes it stick. That's what gives it meaning beyond the moment itself. And that's why, despite all the noise, all the commentary, all the endless cycles of distraction, this still cuts through. Because reality has a way of doing that. No matter how much people try to spin it, reshape it, or drown it out, reality remains. And in this case, reality spoke loudly. Thank you for watching, and I will keep you updated.